Get that shabby man out of my premium seat. People who dress the way he does belong in the back of the plane, not beside me. That spot is mine. Get him out before we're delayed. Move him now. Men like him don't belong up here. Every traveler in the first-class cabin was watching as Ethan Walker rose from the seat he had bought fair and square. In one hand he held his daughter's backpack. With the other, he steadied her shaking fingers. His frayed jacket, worn-down shoes, and unassuming manner had already convinced the crew that he mattered less than the affluent woman now making herself comfortable in his place. Nobody checked the boarding pass tucked beneath her hand. Nobody asked why Ethan stayed so composed as his name vanished from the flight's records. As he moved toward the exit, a small black card slipped briefly from his wallet, bearing a symbol the flight attendant almost placed before it disappeared again. Ethan didn't argue, threaten, or insist on special treatment. He simply took note of the crew members' name tags and glanced once more at the tampered seating display. Moments later, rushed footsteps came from the terminal. What terrible error had they made by judging this single father too hastily? Ethan Walker boarded the first-class cabin of Aurelia Atlantic Airlines with a protective hand on the shoulder of his 10-year-old daughter, Emma. Nothing about his appearance hinted at wealth or status. His dark wool coat had grown soft at the elbows from years of wear. His pale blue shirt was simple, collar open, and his black shoes showed wear along the edges. Emma walked close behind in a cream-colored sweater, hugging a small navy backpack to her chest. They were headed to Seattle for a memorial service in honor of Emma's late mother, followed by her school's science fair the next day. Ethan had picked the earliest non-stop flight so Emma could arrive well-rested, having legitimately booked seats 1A and 1B in first class. Once at the front row, he double-checked their boarding passes, seated Emma on the aisle in 1B, and tucked her backpack beneath the seat. He settled into 1A by the window, buckled in, and watched the ground crew working outside the glass. Emma opened her sketchbook and began drawing the curve of an airplane wing. For a few quiet minutes, they simply looked like a father and daughter getting ready for a long trip. Then Vanessa Sinclair walked in. The mood in the cabin shifted before she'd said a word. She strode down the aisle in a tailored white designer suit, trailed by a nervous assistant hauling an expensive leather case. Several passengers recognized her as the CEO of Sinclair Global and sat up a little straighter. Vanessa barely noticed them, her focus locked onto seat 1A. She stopped beside Ethan, looked over his worn coat, then his scuffed shoes, and turned to Claire Donovan, the lead flight attendant overseeing first class. "Why is this man in my seat?" she demanded. Claire checked Vanessa's boarding pass and saw it clearly assigned her to a different seat farther back. She checked Ethan's pass, too. It plainly read 1A, no ambiguity. For a brief moment, the truth was obvious. Then Claire spotted the Sinclair Global emblem on Vanessa's paperwork and recalled whispers of a lucrative travel deal. Her professional smile stiffened. "It may have been a system glitch," she said, though she knew there hadn't been. Ethan held up his boarding pass. "Emma and I were given these seats when we booked." Vanessa ignored the pass entirely. She looked at Ethan as if his explanation itself was an insult. "I requested this seat weeks ago," she said. Ethan stayed calm. "Your request doesn't override the ticket I already paid for." Emma stopped sketching and looked up. Claire's expression hardened, not because Ethan had raised his voice, but because he'd pushed back against a powerful passenger in front of an audience. She asked him to step into the aisle so they could sort it out without holding up boarding. Ethan wouldn't leave Emma by herself and asked Claire to confirm the reservation through the main system. Claire tapped quickly on her tablet, then turned the screen away from him. Rather than confirm the original booking, she announced the airline needed 1A for an operational accommodation. She offered Ethan an economy seat toward the back. When he asked about Emma, Claire said the girl could stay in 1B alone, or the two of them could take whatever seats were left once boarding wrapped up. Emma's grip tightened on her sketchbook.
Ethan's tone remained level, but his eyes sharpened. "You're suggesting a 10-year-old be separated from her only parent so another passenger can have our seats?" Claire lowered her voice and warned him not to escalate. Vanessa let out a dismissive laugh and told Claire that someone who genuinely belonged in first class would understand the value of discretion. Passengers nearby began turning to look. One man raised his phone, pretending to check a message while recording. Another leaned over to whisper to her seatmate, eyeing Ethan's coat. Emma noticed every glance. Her face flushed and she dropped her gaze, as if she'd done something wrong. Ethan leaned in and quietly told her to keep breathing. Claire radioed Robert Kane, the terminal manager, reporting an uncooperative passenger holding up departure. Robert showed up minutes later, already annoyed at the thought of a delay. Claire got to him first, framing Vanessa as a priority corporate client and Ethan as someone refusing a necessary reassignment. Robert never asked for Ethan's side. He never checked the booking history or considered whether separating a child from her parent broke protocol. He simply took in Vanessa's jewelry, recognized her name, and made up his mind. He told Ethan that airlines reserve the right to reassign seats for operational reasons and offered Ethan a small travel voucher. Ethan asked him to put the operational reason in writing. Robert refused and warned that security would remove him if he kept resisting. Vanessa crossed her arms, watching with open satisfaction. "This is taking forever," she said. "Get him out of here before he ruins the flight for everyone." The weight of everyone's attention pressed down. Emma looked up at her father, eyes glistening. "Did we do something wrong?" she whispered.
Ethan studied Claire's name tag, then Robert's ID badge, committing both names to memory. He noticed the seat assignment field on Claire's tablet had already changed, something he'd never agreed to. That detail bothered him more than the insults had. Without a hint of anger, he took out his paper boarding pass, folded it neatly, and set it on the armrest. Then he stood. Vanessa stepped aside just enough to let him by, smiling thinly, victorious. "Next time," she said, loud enough for others to hear, "buy a ticket that matches your station in life." A few onlookers looked uneasy, but no one spoke up. Ethan helped Emma into her backpack and took her hand. As they walked toward the aisle, Claire announced to the cabin that the seating matter was resolved. Vanessa sank into 1A and rested her hand over Ethan's folded boarding pass without even glancing at the name on it. Emma kept her eyes on the floor as her father led her toward the door. Ethan didn't argue, threaten, or reveal anything about who he was. He simply paused near Claire, glanced once more at the altered display, and told her that changing a passenger's record without their consent was not a matter of seating preference, it was a serious act. Robert brushed off the warning and told him to keep moving. Ethan complied, walking Emma away from the cabin as the other passengers watched the plainly dressed single father give up the seat he'd legally bought. Behind them, Vanessa leaned back against the headrest, satisfied that order, the kind she believed her wealth entitled her to, had been restored. Ethan and Emma weren't sent back into the terminal. Instead, Robert had a gate agent keep them waiting in the jet bridge while the crew hunted for 2 open seats in economy. The cabin door stayed open behind them, mingling the low hum of the plane with the sound of bags being rearranged overhead. Emma stood close to her father, both hands gripping her backpack straps. Her face was still flushed with embarrassment, and she avoided looking through the doorway, where Vanessa now sat in what had been Ethan's window seat. The gate agent kept checking her handheld device, then quietly told Robert that the remaining economy seats were scattered across the cabin. Robert told her to keep looking, more worried about avoiding another clash with Vanessa than about keeping a child near her father. Ethan stood quietly against the jet bridge wall, watching the agent scroll through screens. He didn't push for a better seat or demand Vanessa's removal. His focus stayed on the changes appearing in the reservation system and on Emma's growing distress. For a moment, Emma looked up. "Why didn't you tell them who you are?" There was no pride in the question, just a child trying to make sense of why her father let strangers embarrass him when she believed he could have stopped it instantly. Ethan crouched to her eye level, one hand on her shoulder, glancing toward the aircraft door before answering. "Because if they only respect us once they find out I have power, then they never respected us to begin with." Emma looked toward the cabin again. "But they made everyone think we were lying." Ethan's face softened. He told her the truth didn't lose its weight just because a room full of people failed to recognize it. What mattered wasn't reclaiming a particular seat. It was understanding how easily the people responsible for passengers' safety had tossed aside their own rules. Emma didn't fully grasp it, but she heard the steady certainty in his voice and moved closer, taking his hand. Ethan glanced again at the boarding information on the gate agent's screen. He could see enough to know his original seat hadn't simply been swapped for operational reasons. His name had been pulled from 1A, shifted into an unassigned economy status, and marked as though he'd agreed to the change willingly. Emma's seat was still linked to 1B, creating the impression she'd be traveling without him. No one had asked him to sign anything. No one had logged his objection. Claire hadn't just taken his seat, she'd rewritten the official record to make it look legitimate. Ethan asked the agent whether the change had been logged as voluntary. She hesitated, glancing at Robert. Robert quickly stepped between Ethan and the screen, saying the internal system wasn't his concern, and repeating that the crew was working on accommodating them. Ethan asked who had authorized the change. Robert admitted Claire had made the adjustment and that he'd signed off on it as terminal manager. Ethan asked whether either of them had documented a reason for separating a minor from his only parent. Robert's jaw tightened. He accused Ethan of turning a routine seat change into a legal dispute. Ethan ignored the jab and instead asked the agent not to touch the record again. Robert scoffed, saying Ethan had no authority to instruct airline staff. At that moment, footsteps echoed from the terminal side of the jet bridge. Marcus Bennett, Regional Executive Director for Aurelia Atlantic Airlines, approached with two operations supervisors. He'd been conducting an unannounced review of gate performance ahead of the morning departures when he was told a flight was being held up over a seating dispute. He expected to find either an angry traveler or a flustered employee. Instead, he saw Ethan standing under the harsh jet bridge lights with Emma pressed to his side. Marcus stopped so suddenly, one of the supervisors nearly collided with him. For a moment, he couldn't reconcile the man in the worn coat with the figure he knew from private board meetings and yearly strategy sessions. His gaze moved from Emma to Robert's defensive stance to the open aircraft door. The color drained from his face. "Chairman Walker?" Marcus said. Robert spun toward him, irritated by the interruption, until the words landed. His expression went blank. The gate agent froze, device still in hand. One of the supervisors straightened up at once. Marcus stepped forward, addressing Ethan with careful deference, asking why the chairman of Aurelia Atlantic Airlines was standing outside one of the company's own planes instead of seated aboard it. Robert's gaze flicked between Marcus and Ethan, as if waiting for someone to tell him he'd misheard.
Ethan didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward the agent's device and asked Marcus whether a first-class passenger's confirmed seat could be reassigned without their consent, whether a minor could be separated from a parent without written approval, and whether a terminal manager could sign off on such a change without documenting a legitimate reason. Marcus's eyes cut toward Robert. Robert opened his mouth but found nothing to say. Ethan asked whether the original data could still be recovered. Marcus confirmed every change would be time-stamped and tied to the employee account that made it. Ethan then asked whether the plane could legally take off with an unauthorized alteration still in the passenger record. Marcus didn't answer right away. He already understood the implications.
Finally, Robert spoke up, stepping closer, insisting the whole thing had been a misunderstanding caused by pressure to stay on schedule. He claimed Ethan and Emma were about to be reseated and that there was no reason to make it a bigger issue. Ethan looked at him, unbothered. "I'm not asking for my seat back." Robert looked confused. Ethan kept going, asking whether Claire had verified Vanessa's seat assignment before moving him, whether Robert had reviewed the booking history before approving the swap, and whether either of them had confirmed the updated manifest actually matched who was sitting where. Robert admitted he'd simply trusted Claire's account. Marcus glanced toward the aircraft door, the gravity of the situation settling in. Ethan told him to lock down the reservation data immediately, preserve every version of the manifest, and block any further edits. He ordered the flight held until the entire record could be reviewed, and instructed Marcus to bring Rachel Monroe, the airline's director of legal and compliance, to the gate before any passenger was cleared to leave. Robert stared at Ethan as if the request were pure retaliation. He warned Marcus that a hold would mean delays, missed connections, and real costs. Ethan replied that an unreliable passenger record mattered more than a disrupted schedule. Marcus pulled out his phone and started giving orders. One supervisor headed back to alert operations control. The other moved to the gate desk to change the aircraft's release status. Robert stood frozen as the flight he'd tried so hard to keep on schedule was officially put on hold. Inside the cabin, Claire took a call over the interphone. Her expression tightened as she listened. She glanced toward Vanessa, already checking her watch impatiently. Claire told the captain that ground operations had suspended departure for a passenger verification review. Confusion rippled through the cabin. Passengers who'd watched Ethan get removed assumed the matter was closed, yet the door stayed open. Ground crew gathered at the entrance, and no one could explain why the system had locked up. Vanessa demanded to know how long the delay would last. Claire admitted she had no timeline. Vanessa accused the crew of incompetence, reminding Claire that important people had schedules that shouldn't bend to administrative errors. Claire tried to reassure her, but the confidence she'd shown while pushing Ethan out was gone. She checked her tablet and found she could no longer pull up the passenger list. Every attempt returned a locked status. She looked toward Robert through the open door, hoping he'd fix it, but he wouldn't meet his eyes. 5 minutes after Ethan had been forced from seat 1A, the cabin's announcement system came on. Passengers were told the flight couldn't continue boarding or prepare for departure until a mandatory ground review was finished, and instructed to gather their things and exit calmly. A wave of complaints spread through first class and then the rest of the cabin. Some assumed a mechanical issue, others whispered about a security threat. Phones came out again to record. Vanessa refused to move, telling Claire she'd stay put until someone explained why the whole plane was being emptied. Claire, visibly rattled now, repeated that everyone had to leave. Vanessa gestured at Ethan's folded boarding pass, still partly under her hand, and complained that the delay had only started after the troublesome passenger was removed. Claire said nothing. One by one, passengers filed into the aisle and toward the exit. Vanessa eventually stood, furious at being treated like everyone else, and walked out ahead of Claire, her assistant trailing with the leather case. The instant she stepped onto the jet bridge, everything changed. Ethan was no longer standing alone with his daughter. Marcus Bennett stood beside him, speaking low and urgently. Rachel Monroe had arrived with members of the legal and compliance teams. Senior airport managers clustered nearby, waiting for direction rather than giving it. Emma still held her father's hand, but the people around him now looked at him differently. Robert stood off to the side, pale and silent. As passengers filed out, their grumbling faded into confused murmurs. Those who'd mocked Ethan's worn clothes now stared at the executives surrounding him. Claire came through the doorway last and watched as Marcus addressed Ethan again as Chairman Walker. The words rippled through the jet bridge like a sudden change in pressure. Vanessa stopped mid-step. Her gaze moved from Ethan's modest coat to Marcus, to Rachel, to the assembled leadership, and for the first time since boarding, she had nothing to say. Robert Kane approached Ethan before the last of the passengers had cleared the jet bridge. All the color had left his face, and the confidence he'd carried inside the cabin was gone.
He lowered his voice, hoping the nearby executives wouldn't catch the desperation in it, and said the whole incident had been a serious misunderstanding. He insisted he'd never meant to disrespect Ethan or Emma, and claimed he'd only been trying to prevent a delay. Then, in his panic, he said the thing that gave everything away. "If I'd known you were Chairman Walker, I would have handled this completely differently." Ethan looked at him for a long moment while Emma stood quietly beside him, still holding his hand. His voice stayed even. "That's exactly the problem, Robert. You think we deserved fair treatment only after you found out my title." Robert tried to walk it back, but Ethan kept going. He pointed out that the boarding passes were valid before Marcus recognized him, that Emma was a child traveling with her father long before anyone knew who he was, and that the rules meant to protect passengers hadn't suddenly mattered more just because the chairman happened to be involved. Robert said he'd trusted Claire's account and believed the reassignment was operationally necessary. Ethan asked what operational reason justified pulling a paying passenger from 1A and dropping them into unassigned economy while putting someone else in his seat without ever checking her ticket. Robert had no answer. He glanced at Vanessa, hoping she'd speak up for him, but she stood with arms crossed, her expression flickering between anger and disbelief. Ethan turned to the gathered passengers and made clear the flight hadn't been halted over wounded pride. It had been stopped because the official passenger record had been altered without authorization. A seat assignment ties a person's identity to their place on the flight, and once that information is falsified, the company can no longer trust that the manifest reflects who's actually on board. This wasn't a private slight fixable with an apology or a free voucher. It was a breakdown in procedure, accountability, and safety. Rachel Monroe stood at a portable terminal with 2 compliance staffers, while Marcus secured the gate area. She pulled the original reservation file, the current manifest, the employee access logs, and every change made during boarding. Because Ethan had insisted on locking the data early, the full sequence of edits had been preserved. Rachel reviewed it carefully, then turned the screen so Marcus and Ethan could see. The original booking clearly showed Ethan Walker in 1A and Emma Walker in 1B, both tickets paid, confirmed, and checked in without any flags. Vanessa Sinclair's ticket showed an entirely different first-class seat farther back. No duplicate booking, no system glitch. Rachel opened the change log. Claire Donovan's account had pulled Ethan from 1A just minutes before departure, shifted him to unassigned economy, and moved Vanessa into his original seat, then marked the change as voluntarily accepted by Ethan. There was no written consent, no signature, no recorded confirmation to back that up. Rachel asked Claire directly when Ethan had agreed to this. Claire said she assumed his decision to stand and walk away counted as acceptance. Rachel reminded her that Ethan had only stood after being threatened by removal by security. Compliance rules don't allow forced compliance to be logged as consent. Claire said she was under pressure, trying to keep the cabin calm. Rachel asked why she disregarded the boarding pass Ethan showed her. Claire admitted Vanessa was a high-value client who'd claimed to have requested the front seat in advance. Rachel pointed out the record showed no such request had ever been approved. Then she pulled up the authorization log. Robert's account had approved Claire's change less than a minute after it was submitted. No sign he'd reviewed Ethan's pass, spoken to him directly, checked the booking history, or considered what separating Emma from her father would mean. Robert claimed Claire had described Ethan as disruptive and said he'd believed swift action was warranted. Ethan asked whether standing quietly beside a legally purchased seat counted as disruptive simply because he'd declined to hand it over to someone wealthier. Again, Robert had no answer. A young flight attendant named Noah Mitchell had been hovering at the edge of the group, clearly unsure if he wanted to speak up. He'd been working the cabin during boarding and had
seen Claire's original review of the tickets. When Rachel asked if any crew member had seen the seat map before it was altered, Noah raised his hand. Claire shot him a sharp look, but Marcus told him to speak freely. Noah pulled out his phone and explained he'd photographed the original seating chart earlier because the cabin tablet had briefly frozen during boarding. He'd wanted a backup in case it happened again while confirming meals and names. The photo was time-stamped before Ethan was removed and clearly showed Ethan in 1A, Emma in 1B, and Vanessa in her actual assigned seat. He had a second photo, taken after Claire's changes, and the difference was unmistakable. Rachel asked if he'd overheard anything between Vanessa and Claire beforehand. Noah hesitated, then admitted Vanessa had complained about being seated near the galley and mentioned that Sinclair Global would soon be choosing an airline for a major corporate travel contract, implying that staff who understood the needs of important clients tended to be remembered favorably. Claire looked down. Noah said her attitude toward Ethan shifted right after that conversation. Before it, she had acknowledged his boarding pass was valid. Afterward, she started calling it a system error. Vanessa stepped forward, accusing Noah of twisting an innocent comment. She insisted she'd never explicitly told Claire to falsify anything and had only expected service befitting someone bringing significant business to the airline. Rachel replied that the investigation would determine how much her pressure contributed to the violation, but her status didn't erase what had happened. Several passengers who'd been watching nearby started talking among themselves. One, the man who'd recorded the confrontation in first class, approached Marcus and offered his video. Rachel reviewed it on his phone, while others gathered close enough to hear the audio. It showed Ethan sitting calmly with Emma, Vanessa looming over him, and Claire brushing aside the evidence he'd offered. It captured Vanessa mocking Ethan's clothes, questioning whether he belonged in first class, and demanding the crew remove him. It also caught Emma asking whether they'd done something wrong. The final clip showed Vanessa settling into 1A, while Ethan's folded boarding pass sat beneath her hand. The passengers who'd laughed or watched silently now avoided Ethan's eyes. Vanessa didn't apologize. Instead, she accused Ethan of exploiting his position to stage a public spectacle and damage her reputation over what she called a minor seating disagreement. She reminded Ethan that Sinclair Global's contract was worth millions to the airline and warned that if he let her be humiliated in front of everyone, the deal would fall through and the board would hear exactly why. Ethan's expression didn't shift. A contract that depends on employees ignoring safety procedures and mistreating ordinary passengers isn't a deal this airline should take. Vanessa told him he was being emotional because his daughter had witnessed everything. Ethan said Emma's presence made the failure more painful, not more serious. The record would have been just as false whether the person pushed out of that seat was the chairman, a mechanic, a teacher, or someone flying for the very first time. He wasn't willing to trade passenger dignity and procedural integrity for Sinclair Global's money. Rachel informed Vanessa that her premium customer privileges were suspended pending review of her role in the incident. Vanessa tried to head back toward the gate, but security blocked her path. Marcus told her she wouldn't be allowed to reboard or re-enter the restricted area. She demanded Claire back her up, insisting she'd never ordered an unlawful change. Claire said nothing. Vanessa looked around at the passengers who'd watched her take Ethan's seat and realized no one was going to defend her. Security escorted her out while her assistant followed with the leather case. Her white suit and diamond jewelry no longer drew admiration. They only made her easier to identify as the woman from the video, now circulating among the waiting crowd. Rachel turned to Claire next, formally revoking her authority to work the flight and suspending her employee access pending a full investigation. Claire began crying, saying she'd spent years building her career. Ethan didn't respond with cruelty. He told her that her experience made it worse, not better, since she'd known the rules and broken them anyway to impress someone powerful. Claire handed over her tablet and ID before being escorted out by a supervisor. Robert lingered nearby, hoping his apology and years of service might spare him, but as Rachel dug deeper into the compliance archive, she found the morning's incident wasn't an isolated case. Multiple earlier complaints accused terminal staff of favoring wealthy or well-known travelers during seating disputes, families separated, passengers pressured into downgrades, complaints closed out without real review.
Every one of those files had passed through Robert's office. In several cases, he'd marked them resolved without conducting interviews or gathering documentation. Robert claimed the complaints lacked evidence and that he'd been trying to keep minor issues from piling up. Rachel told him he hadn't reduced the problem, he'd buried it. Marcus formally suspended him from all terminal duties and disabled his system access. Robert looked to Ethan, asking for a chance to explain himself. Ethan told him the investigation would give him that opportunity, but he'd no longer control the records or the staff who might be asked to testify. Robert handed over his ID. Around them, the balance of power had shifted entirely. Ethan still wore the same worn coat and scuffed shoes, but no one saw him as unimportant anymore. Vanessa had been removed, Claire had lost her position, and Robert had been stripped of authority. Yet Ethan showed no satisfaction. Looking down at Emma, her face a mix of relief and sadness, he understood that uncovering the truth was only the first step. The company still had to prove fairness wouldn't vanish the next time someone without a powerful title was the one being mistreated.
Ethan stood before the displaced passengers in the gate lounge, Emma quietly beside him, her hand in his. He didn't hide behind Marcus, Rachel, or his own title. Instead, he personally apologized for the delay, explaining that everyone had been asked to deplane because the manifest could no longer be trusted after the unauthorized changes. He acknowledged that the inconvenience was real, missed connections, disrupted plans, and that the airline wouldn't excuse its failure just because the truth eventually came out. Aurelia Atlantic Airlines quickly arranged meals, access to a private lounge, rebooking, and compensation for every passenger affected. As tensions eased, several people who'd watched Ethan's humiliation came over to speak with him. The man who'd filmed the confrontation apologized for staying silent while continuing to record. A woman who'd laughed quietly admitted she'd judged him by his coat before knowing a single fact. Others confessed they'd sensed that something was wrong, but had stayed quiet out of fear of drawing trouble to themselves. Ethan accepted their apologies without resentment, but he didn't let them believe silence was harmless. He reminded them that cruelty often draws its strength not just from the person doing it, but from the crowd that watches and chooses not to step in. Emma listened closely, understanding her father wasn't trying to shame anyone. He wanted them to remember the next person who might be standing alone, with no title, no money, and no influence to protect them. The internal investigation moved fast because the records had already been preserved. Robert was dismissed for approving falsified passenger information, burying earlier complaints, and using his authority to favor people he deemed important. Claire's employment was terminated for reassigning Ethan's seat without consent, falsely logging the change as voluntary, and risking the separation of a child from her only parent. Noah, on the other hand, was formally recognized for preserving the original seating evidence and speaking honestly when it could have cost him his job. Ethan recommended him for the airline's leadership training program, noting that courage and integrity mattered far more than blind obedience. Before leaving the terminal, Ethan approved a set of immediate reforms across Aurelia Atlantic Airlines. No employee could pull a passenger from a confirmed seat to accommodate someone wealthy, famous, or commercially valuable. Any seat change involving a child would require clear approval from the guardian. Discrimination complaints would go to an independent department instead of being handled by local managers who might have reason to bury them. Employees would be guaranteed the right to refuse instructions that violated procedure without fear of retaliation, and senior executives would be required to fly anonymously at regular intervals so they'd personally experience the service ordinary passengers received. When the replacement aircraft was ready, Marcus arranged for Ethan and Emma to be seated back in 1A and 1B. But before boarding, Ethan noticed an exhausted mother helping her young son, whose leg was injured, move through the crowd. The boy looked worn out from the delay.
Ethan quietly gave up his and Emma's first-class seats for them. Marcus offered to find another premium option, but Ethan declined. He and Emma boarded with everyone else and took 2 ordinary seats farther back. Once settled, Emma asked why he'd given away the seats after fighting so hard to prove they were rightfully theirs. Ethan explained he'd never fought for the comfort of a chair. He'd fought because the rules had been broken, and because people had been treated as if their dignity depended on their wealth. Justice wasn't about reclaiming everything that had been taken from them. It was about making sure the same thing couldn't happen to someone else. Emma glanced toward the front of the plane, where the injured boy now rested beside his mother, then leaned her head against her father's shoulder. As the plane climbed toward Seattle, the morning's events stopped feeling like a story about a powerful executive revealing his identity. They became something else entirely. A lesson about the kind of power that actually mattered. Real authority wasn't the ability to remove someone from a seat, silence an employee, or demand obedience. It was the responsibility to stand beside those who couldn't protect themselves and to fix the system so they'd never have to stand alone again.